Hello everyone. In this section we're going to be covering events and listeners. Events and listeners are the basic structure that Corona uses for a large variety of hardware hooks. So this includes things such as touches to the screen, the gyroscope, the GPS, and much more. In this section we're going to be primarily covering touch listeners, so when someone touches the screen. In later series we may cover the GPS, accelerometer, and more. So the first thing I'd like you to do is go ahead and open your main file and your example file in the events and listeners group. And we're going to go ahead and, first things first, add an image to the screen. So just as we've done in the previous examples, we're going to do image test and create an image. I have provided one, but if you'd like to add your own, that's more than fine. Let's get that image somewhere where we can see it. Let's just go ahead and put it 40 by 240. So now we have our image on the screen. What we want to do is go ahead and add an event listener to the image. Now, in order to add an event listener, we actually need the function listener to activate when the event occurs. So when this image is touched, we need a bit of code to run every time it's touched. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a function called image_touch. We're going to pass event to it. So we have this nice function. Right now, let's just keep it empty. And then we're going to say image test, add event listener, touch, and then the listener is going to be image touch. So what we're doing here is we're telling this image to add an event listener of the type touch using the function image touch. So what this is doing is it's detecting every time that this is touched, it runs this function. And this function will pass the information from that event to it every time it's run. So now what I'd like you to do in this function is do print event.phase. And this will print every time this listener is activated, print the phase that it's in. So see, when you first press, you should see in your print statements began. If you move around, you'll see moved, and if you let go, it'll be ended. So those are three of the most basic phase types for an event. So an event also has a target. The target is the actual object it's referring to. So let's print here, print event.target.x. Now you'll see it prints the x value, 240. That is the current x location of this target. So we could print any information about this target, about this image, from this information. So if we wanted to say, let's say image test info equals hello world, we could print hello world here. As you see here. So the target you can use for a variety of things, such as moving the target inside the event and more. So another example I'm going to give here is let's go ahead and print after event.phase, we're going to print event.x and then event.y. And this is going to print the x and y location of the event. So as I move around, you'll see here in the console the actual x and y changed based on where I was pressing or where I moved. So why don't we try next? We're going to tell the event.target.x to equal the event.x, and we're going to tell the same to the target's y. So now, as you press and you move, you'll see that you are actually dragging the image based on the event x and y location. This is a very simple example of how to make a drag object. And as you'll see in the final example, all of this is provided as well. So the next thing we're going to go over is creating a group, same as we did in the last section, and attaching an event listener to it. So let's go ahead and create a rectangle. And we're going to do display.newRect. And give it a size of 200 by 200 at location 200 by 200. So we should have a square right here. Let's go ahead and make it a little wider, say 400 wide. Right. Move it off of the image. Alright, so now we have these two objects. Let's add them both to a display group. So first things first, we need to create a display group. So we'll do, and then we need to insert both of those items into the group. So add the two items that we've created. Oops. And now, rather than adding this event listener to the image, we're going to add it to the group. So now we'll see that when you drag, you actually are dragging both objects. Of course, the issue here is that it's based on the group's X and Y locations now, not the individual images. So if you press, you get the location, but it tends to jump far off because it's changing the X and Y of the group and no longer of the individual images. So, as you can see, it is very feasible to create an event based on either an image, a rectangle, a circle, anything like that, and you can do it in groups as well. So next up, we're going to go ahead and take a look at creating various other types of event listeners. So what we're going to do first is look at the focus. So as you can see here in the example, we're going to go ahead and just take this example, bring it over. And I'll explain what it does. So what we're going to do is we're going to create, let's go back to the individual image. So image test, add event listener. We don't really need the group for this. We are going to add drag touch to this event listener. So we're going to have this function, drag touch, be the listener. Now what we're doing here is we have multiple stages here based on the phases that we had before. Of this listener. So when the phases begin, it will set the focus to this object. What that means is no other object on the screen will react to this touch other than the target itself. Then we have it moving, if the phase is moved, to the X and Y location. And lastly, when it ends, we remove that focus. So you should be able to grab and drag around. Now, let's try adding a second image to see what happens if we drag one over the other. So if you create a new image here, we have two circles. You'll notice right now only one is dragging around because the other is still has no event listener. Let's go ahead and make this new image slightly smaller so we can tell the difference between the two. 0.5, 0.5. So now we have a smaller version of our image. We can drag this one, but right now we have no listeners on the second one. So let's remedy that by adding a new image, add event listener. And we're going to add the same listener. So you can use the same function for multiple objects. It just reacts to each one as a different target. So if we click and drag this one, we'll see right now we can drag it around as we did before. We can click this one now and drag it around as we had before. But if we tried to click both, it's only going to select one. It's going to select whichever one triggers first. So, as you see here, it's one or the other. Now, if we didn't have these focuses, let's go ahead and comment them out. It will actually grab both of them and activate this for both. Because an event listener goes through and checks every object that has that type of an event listener, so touch in this situation, and it checks to see if each one is being touched, and if so, it runs this function. So that is why you would set focus. Set focus makes it so only this particular object is being referenced for this type of interface. So we can make it so only one can be touched at a time. So that's the basic of set focus. Last, I'm going to show you how to remove listeners, and this is quite easy. We're going to remove the listener for the smaller image here. Do new image, remove event listener, the listener type, and the actual function itself. So just like when you added it, you remove it in the same way using remove event listener. And now we'll see that this is no longer able to be touched. You cannot drag it, you can do nothing to it because we removed the listener. Now, this wouldn't work if we gave it the wrong function, because this isn't the actual function that this listener is attached to. So you need to ensure that you have the right parameters passing to that removing of the event listener. So that's the basics of removing event listeners. So the last thing, and we're not going to cover it in this series, is the runtime listeners. So runtime listeners are listeners that work for the entirety of the run environment. So there's a large variety of these, GPS, the accelerometer, various things like that. There's also listeners for the collision types when we're using the actual in-game physics engine. There's audio listeners. There's plenty of listener types. You can find all these in the API in events. So these are all the different event types. And we will cover a few of these later on in the advanced tutorial. So there you have it, the basics of events and listeners.